Okay, so welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. Okay, so we're currently in the process of discussing the corticospinal tract. I would like to apologize for the abrupt ending to the previous video. I had to chop out the final bit because the fire alarm went off. Okay, so I was just in the process of discussing the naming of different portions of the corticospinal tract. So this is where the naming becomes a bit more complicated. So, if someone just says the corticospinal tract, what you can assume they mean is the portion of the corticospinal tract prior to the decussation. Okay, so the portion prior to the bottom of the medulla, basically. Okay, and on that, but in that portion above the major motor decussation, everything's very simple because each of the corticospinal tracts is on the same side as the cerebral cortex which gave rise to it. Okay, so for instance we have the left corticospinal tract here and the right corticospinal tract here. So things are nice and simple then. Okay, when you get this major motor decussation, the naming then becomes more complicated. Okay, and everything's just named according to which side it's on. So, the left corticospinal tract here is going to split into the left anterior corticospinal tract here, and then the right lateral corticospinal tract. Okay, so this will be the right lateral corticospinal tract here. Okay, whereas the right corticospinal tract is going to give rise to the right anterior corticospinal tract and the left lateral corticospinal tract. So be aware of that the left lateral corticospinal tract comes from the right corticospinal tract, and the right lateral corticospinal tract comes from the left corticospinal tract. Be aware of that difficulty with the naming. It's easy as long as you remember everything's just named according to what actual side it's on, whether it's on the left side or the right side. Okay, but it's annoying because then you've got this problem of the left lateral corticospinal tract coming from the contralateral corticospinal tract. Okay, but that's something that once you're aware of it, hopefully you won't forget. Okay, right, so now what's going to happen is these bundles are going to descend along the spinal cord, okay, and they're going to remain in roughly the same positions. And at each stage of the spinal cord, axons will be leaving these bundles to actually innervate lower motor neurons. So now let me show you a section of the spinal cord where we actually have roots coming out at that level of the spinal cord. Okay, so now I'll show you another cross-section of the spinal cord then. Okay, so once again, here we have the oval-shaped spinal cord. We're taking a transverse section, okay, and we have the anterior median fissure at the front, the posterior median sulcus at the back, okay, and the grey matter is still going to be in this butterfly shape. Okay, like so, with the ventral horn and the dorsal horn. Okay, and then you've got these three white matter columns. You've got the two dorsal columns here, the left dorsal column and the right dorsal column, the two lateral columns, the left lateral column, the right lateral column, and the two anterior columns, the left anterior column and the right anterior column. Okay, now we're going to actually have, I'm going to say that we've taken this cross-section at a level where you actually have roots coming out of the spinal cord, and I'll only show this on one side. Okay, so here are two roots coming out of the spinal cord. Now, this is the dorsal root here, it's coming out from the back of the spinal cord. Okay, and this is the ventral root here. Okay, now, the axons of lower motor neurons, so the real motor neurons, remember, those are going to come out of the ventral root always. They never come out of the dorsal root. They always come out of the ventral root. And what's going to happen very quickly is the dorsal root and the ventral root are going to come together, like so. Okay, and you're then going to have the spinal nerve for that level coming off here. So this is our spinal nerve, and of course you'll be having this bilaterally. I'm only showing the left spinal nerve here, but you'll also have a right spinal nerve. Now, this blob that I didn't say anything about but just drew, this is the dorsal root ganglion. Okay, so the dorsal spinal root doesn't contain axons of neurons coming out of the spinal cord. Instead, it contains axons of neurons coming into the spinal cord, the sensory neurons. So the sensory neurons that are coming in, they will come in through the dorsal root. They'll come in through the spinal nerve and then they'll go down the dorsal root to enter the spinal cord. And they have their cell bodies, the primary sensory neurons have their cell bodies in this dorsal root ganglion rather than actually in the spinal cord itself. Okay, right. So, now let's show the lower motor neurons. So lower motor neurons have their cell bodies in the ventral horn of the spinal cord here. They then send their axons out through the ventral root of the spinal cord, okay, and then into the spinal nerve here, and then it will go off and eventually it will find some skeletal muscle fibers. It will branch, okay, and it will then synapse on a whole bunch of skeletal muscle fibers. So here's one, here's another, and here is another. Okay, and the collection of all the skeletal muscle fibers that this single lower motor neuron here innervates is known as the motor unit for that lower motor neuron. Okay, so if you activate this lower motor neuron here, and I think I'll add a bit of colour onto this picture. Okay, so we'll colour this lower motor neuron here in red. If you activate that lower motor neuron and get it to fire action potentials, then the motor unit is what's going to contract, and then that consists of more than just one skeletal muscle fiber. All of these skeletal muscle fibers here are going to contract. Okay, right, so here is our lower motor neuron here then. Okay, so now let's show upper motor neurons leaving the corticospinal tracts to innervate the lower motor neuron. Okay, so either this lower motor neuron can be innervated by fibers that have come from the ipsilateral lateral corticospinal tract. So in this case we're looking at the left side of the spinal cord, so it would be the left lateral corticospinal tract here, or they can come from the contralateral anterior corticospinal tract, because remember this is a left side lower motor neuron, so its upper motor neuron has to have come from the right primary motor cortex, okay? And remember, if it's come from the right primary motor cortex, it came down the right corticospinal tract, so it's either in the left lateral corticospinal tract or the right anterior corticospinal tract, so either here or here. Now, if it's coming from the left lateral corticospinal tract, then all that needs to happen is it just comes out of the lateral corticospinal tract and then directly innervates the the lower motor neuron. If, on the other hand, it's coming from the anterior corticospinal tract, it has to move through this little white matter connection between the two sides of the spinal cord, so it does have to cross in the end, okay, and then it can innervate the lower motor neuron. And this little connection of white matter that joins the two halves of the spinal cord, this is known as the white commissure of the spinal cord. Okay, so this is the white commissure. Okay, so that then is how upper motor neurons can innervate lower motor neurons in the ventral horn of the spinal cord. Okay, so to review the entire corticospinal tract then now, you start off with your BET cell, or your upper motor neuron, or your giant pyramidal cell, in the primary motor cortex up here. Okay, and it, depending on the area depending on the area of the skeletal muscles which the lower motor neuron, which it's going to synapse onto, is going to innervate, it will be in a specific area. So there is this motor homunculus depending on which area it's actually going to cause movement in. Okay, these BET cells will send their axons into the subcortical white matter, and then they'll converge to the internal capsule, okay, which we've got shown here. Okay, the internal capsule is this great band of axons that are going to move in between the caudate nucleus and the putamen, and they're then going to come into the crus cerebri of the midbrain. Okay, so here we're looking at the left-hand side, so they're coming into the left crus cerebri of the midbrain. Okay, they will then pass down the left crus cerebri of the midbrain in the middle 1/3 of it, okay, into the pons, where they'll move through the middle of the pons, still on the same side as the primary motor cortex where the cell bodies are. Okay, so the axons are moving down in this great bundle, then they go down through the pyramid here, again on the same side as the side of the primary motor cortex where the cell body is. Okay, and then at the bottom you will then get the major motor decussation. So what will happen then is around 90% of the fibres will move into the contralateral lateral corticospinal tract, so in this case the right lateral corticospinal tract, and 10% of them will stay on the ipsilateral anterior corticospinal tract, so in this case the left anterior corticospinal tract. These will descend down until they get to the level of the lower motor neuron that they actually want to innervate. Okay, now if we're talking about an axon that is in the lateral corticospinal tract, then all it has to do is just move this short distance into the ventral horn here, and then innervate that lower motor neuron, which will then go out of the ventral horn and go to the out of the ventral root and then go to the skeletal muscle fibers. Okay, if on the other hand you're in the anterior corticospinal tract, you firstly have to cross through the anterior white commissure here. Okay, and it should be the anterior white commissure to be extra precise. Okay, of the spinal cord, and then into the ventral horn on the opposite side. Okay, and then you'll innervate the lower motor neuron, which will then go out of the ventral root into the mixed spinal nerve and to the skeletal muscle fibers that you're going to innervate. Okay, right, so that now completes the corticospinal tract. In the next video, what we will do is discuss the corticobulbar tract so that we also understand that, and then we'll put it all together and talk a little bit more about amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, particularly focusing on why do you get that lateral sclerosis.